Good morning. Good to see everyone this morning. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So, I see you, Brother Wayne and Miss Anita are not here. Do you know anyone here anything? If they may be planning on being gone somewhere or anything? So, we want to check on them. But I do want to say it's good to be back. It's good to be back. I missed y'all last week. I know Brother Justin did a good job in my absence, and I appreciate him. I did hear that, I guess he said he was accepted into the beloved Rock of Ages prison ministry, and he's now officially on deputation. So that's good. So appreciate Brother Justin taking care of y'all last week for me, and I'll tell you what, like I said, it's good to be back. It's funny because when I leave, I was in Virginia last Sunday, and then I was in Maryland, and then every state on the way back, I made it into West Virginia, and I'm like, thank you, Lord, I'm in West Virginia, because I know West Virginia's leading to Virginia, and then Virginia, I actually ended up going to Tennessee, then into North Carolina, and then when I left North Carolina on Friday, I crossed over from North Carolina into North Georgia up there, and every minute I got a little bit closer, I got a little bit happier to be back home. So, but anyway, like I said, appreciate y'all being here. If you have your Bible, turn to Matthew chapter number 26, and we're going to try and pick back up where we left off 2 weeks ago. I know it's a little awkward whenever you're gone for an extended period of time and picking back up where you left off. But as you know, we've been in the trial that Jesus is facing. He's already went through the garden. They've already taken him, and now they've got him. In Caiaphas' palace, and they've got him, and they're trying him. And so we're gonna look at that. And we looked at 2 weeks ago. We just looked at how much they hated him. That's what we looked at a couple weeks ago, and just how much that the people who were trying him, it was never going to be a fair trial. It was not a jury of his peers. It was a jury of his enemies. All those people that were trying him were also the people that were going to judge him, and they absolutely hated him. And so we're going to look at some of that. We're going to look at some of that this week, and so anyway, let me just start reading in Matthew chapter number 26, verse number 57. It says, "And they that had laid hold on Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. But Peter followed him afar off unto the high priest's palace, and went in and sat with the servants to see the end. Now the chief priests and elders and all the council sought false witness against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Yea, though many false witnesses came, yet found they none. At the last came 2 false witnesses, and said, This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God, and to build it in 3 days. And the high priest arose and said unto him, Answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witness against thee? But Jesus held his peace. And the high priest answered and said unto him, I adjure thee by the living God, that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus saith unto him, Thou hast said. Nevertheless I say unto you, hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power, and coming in the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest rent his clothes, saying, He has spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? Behold, now ye have heard his blasphemy. What think ye? They answered and said, He is guilty of death. Then did they spit in his face and buffeted him, and others smote him with the palms of their hands, saying, Prophesy unto us, thou Christ. Who is he that smote thee? Stop reading right there. Turn over to Mark chapter number 14. Mark chapter number 14, and we'll look at verse number 55. Mark 14:55, it says, And the chief priests and all the council sought for witnesses against Jesus to put him to death, and found none. For many bare false witness against him, but their witness agreed not together. And there rose certain and bare false witness against him, saying, We heard him say, I will destroy this temple, that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. But neither so did their witness agree together. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, Answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witness against thee? But he held his peace and answered nothing. Again the high priest asked him and said unto him, Art thou the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am. And ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest rent his clothes and saith, What need we any further of witnesses? Ye have heard the blasphemy, what think ye? And they all condemned him to be guilty of death. And some began to spit on him, and to cover his face, and to buffet him, and to say unto him, Prophesy. And the servants did strike him with the palms of their hands. So I'm not going to read. I'm not going to read in Luke right now, but we understand. That these two passages right here are talking where Jesus is before Caiaphas. He's before the priests and the scribes and the Pharisees. He's before them, and he's being tried, and they're trying to come up with a justification for what they wanted to do. Basically, the sentence was death. And they just had to figure out a justification, and they were trying to do a religious justification why they could condemn Jesus to death. But as we know, Jesus, there was no true justification to kill Jesus. There was no true justification. But yet Jesus came to die, and so he had to sit there and submit himself to this trial, to this this mockery of a trial. He had to submit himself to that. And I said it a couple weeks ago that this was no doubt the single greatest act of self-restraint that's ever been, because here you have God. Jesus was God. While I was in Maryland, the false Jehovah Witnesses came to the door of my mother's house. And they want to pretend and act like we have all this in common. But guess what? We can't have anything in common if we can't agree on who Jesus is. If we can't agree that Jesus was God, is God, and always will be God, then we don't have all this in common. You're a false religion. You're false teachers. You're sending people to hell, even though you don't believe in that either. And so anyway, but here are these Jews, and they're trying Jesus, and they hated him. We talked about that a couple weeks ago, how that they hated him. And in this passage right here, the Bible talks about how they sought for false witnesses. Again, I mean, if you got a problem with someone, Chris, if you got a problem with someone, I mean, we all have issues with people at times. But you ought to know you're in the wrong if you can't find anyone that can just tell the truth and say, hey, this is what I saw, this is what I heard, this is what he did. Brother Tyrone, they didn't have anybody. They couldn't call on anybody to say, tell me something Jesus did wrong. And no doubt, they were willing to pay. They were willing to pay. And I mentioned it whenever we were talking about Judas Iscariot. They paid Judas 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus. But no doubt what they really wanted, Chris, was for Judas to say, I saw him do this. I saw him do that. I saw him do this terrible thing. But they couldn't get any of that out of Judas. So all they could get out of Judas was, hey, tell us where we can find him. Tell us somewhere where we can take him. Tell us somewhere where we can take him privately so that the multitude doesn't know, because the Jews knew that were trying Jesus right here, and Pilate understood that they were going to have a mob on their hand. And so they tried to take Jesus in secret. They went to the garden and took him in secret at night. But they sought out these false witnesses. Again, like you said, you think about a trial. And that's one of the, you have to stand and put your hand on the Bible. You swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God. Again, because, they don't want people to perjure themselves. And if you're caught perjuring yourself, you get in a lot of trouble. But here are these chief priests. They're like, hey, we need somebody to perjure themselves. We don't need you to tell the truth. We don't need you to tell the good things that you saw him do. We don't need you to tell all the wonderful things he's done. We don't need you to tell about the blind that received their sight. We don't need you to tell the lame that began to walk. We don't need you to tell that the dumb was able to speak. We don't want you to talk about those things. I just need somebody to come up here and say he did something wrong. You don't have to turn there, but if you look in Deuteronomy chapter number 5, verse number 20, we're looking at the Ten Commandments right here, and it says, neither shalt thou bear false witness. Neither shalt thou bear false witness against thy neighbor. But here are the chief priests, and them, they're looking for someone to bear false witness. But if you look in Deuteronomy chapter number 19, in verse number 16, it says, if a false witness rise up against any man to testify against him that which is wrong, then both the men between whom the controversy is shall stand before the Lord. Now you think about this right here. Now this is Moses again, who these Pharisees and these chief priests who they love to quote, Chris. They love to quote Moses. I mean, that's who they looked up to. That's who they claimed to be, disciples of, was Moses. And so that they're to stand before the Lord, before the priest and the judges which shall be in those days. And the judges shall make diligent inquisition, and behold, if the witness be a false witness, and hath testified falsely against his brother, then shall ye do unto him as he had thought to have done unto his brother, so shalt thou put the evil away from among you. And those which will remain shall hear and fear, and shall henceforth commit no more any such evil among you. And thine eye shall not pity, but life shall go for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. And so here you have in Deuteronomy, in Moses' law, here you have where the Bible is teaching us that, hey, if you have a false witness, they're supposed to come before the priest, and the priest is supposed to they're supposed to listen to both sides of the argument, both sides of the story. They're supposed to make inquisition and find out, okay, which one of these guys is telling the truth. And then whichever one was making up a lie, Chris, if you think about it in this, I mean, they're trying to put Jesus to death. All of these people that came as false witnesses, had the priests been doing their real job, the job that they said they were followers of Moses, had they actually been doing what Moses said they were supposed to do, what God through Moses said they were supposed to do, every one of those people that came up willingly and lied about Jesus, they should have been the ones to be stoned. And to be put to death. But that's not what was going on, Brother Parks. Again, like I said, here are these people that are supposed to be the highest religious people in the Jewish religion, and they're doing everything they're doing is violating their own religion. They're violating their office. They're corrupting their office, which had already been corrupted. But they're corrupting their office and violating their office. Why? Because they hated Jesus. Because they hated him. Because they hated him. And so it says they sought out false witnesses. They sought out these false witnesses. And even the false witnesses couldn't agree. Again, Brother Parks, you'd think you could go and say, all right, this is what I want you to say. I just want you to go in there, and I just want you to say this right here. And then the one would come in and he'd say it and he couldn't say it right. And they're like, no, bring in another one. And they brought in another one. And they bring in another one. And over and over and over, they sought out many false witnesses. Many people came and they told stories, Chris, and they couldn't even get their stories to match. And the priest he finally just like, all right, we're done. We're done with this here. But I want you to notice right here in the book of in Matthew chapter number 27. Matthew chapter number 27, verse number 62. I want you to notice that they testify against Jesus. They're like, destroy this temple, which we know he said it, and we knew what he was talking about. But they made it out like he was talking about the actual temple. But in verse number 62, now Jesus, right here where we're looking at, Jesus has already been crucified. But in verse 62, and the high priest arose and said unto him, in Matthew 27. Verse number 62. Now the next day that followed, the day of the preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees came together unto Pilate, saying, Sir, we remember that deceiver said, while he was yet alive, after 3 days I will rise again. Now wait a second, they just judged him, Chris. And they judged him like he was going to destroy the actual building of the temple. Even in judgment, they knew that these witnesses were witnessing against Jesus. Even in this, Brother Croft, they knew that Jesus was talking about his body. They didn't think it was the temple. You even see some of them. I think some of them were deceived, but I think the highest ones, they knew what he was talking about. You know, you even see them, and I didn't read the passage right here, but you see them even when Jesus is being crucified, they come up and they rail against him and say, thou that destroys this temple. Even when he was being crucified, they're throwing that in his face. But here we have, after Jesus is crucified and he's dead and being buried, they go to Pilate and they say, Sir, we remember that deceiver said while he was yet alive, after 3 days I will rise again. Command therefore that the sepulchre be made sure until the third day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away and say unto the people, He is risen from the dead, so the last there shall be worse than the first. Pilate said unto them, Ye have a watch, go your way. I like this statement right here. Make it as sure as you can. I think even Pilate in his heart of hearts, again, he condemned a guilty man, or he condemned an innocent man and put an innocent man to death. And I think even in Pilate's heart of hearts, he knew there was something different about Jesus. There was something different about Jesus. And now he hears, wait a second, this guy said that if you kill him, he's going to rise again the third day. And Pilate said, make it as sure as you can. Make it as sure as you can. I think in that make it as sure as you can, I think even Pilate said, I don't think it's going to work. I don't think it's going to work. So they went and made the sepulchre sure, sealing the stone and setting a watch. So they went and did everything they could, Chris. Everything they could, but everything they could wasn't good enough. All their evil, everything they tried wasn't going to be good enough. It was not going to keep Jesus in that grave. And so again, like I said, here are these priests, and so they try Jesus, and they start out with seeking these false witnesses. And these false witnesses, they couldn't get to agree, and they finally got them to agree, and then their agreement was on something that the chief priests, they knew that it wasn't true. They knew it wasn't true. They knew he wasn't talking about the temple. They knew he wasn't talking about that temple. They knew he's talking about the temple of his body. And so finally, the high priest stands up and says, okay, we're done. And he says, hey, Jesus, don't you have anything to say for yourself? Don't you have anything to say for yourself? I mean, can you not say anything for yourself? Listen to what you're being charged with. I don't know if you remember, but back in the day, I used to listen to Rush Limbaugh, and Rush Limbaugh used to talk about how that when a Republican is in trouble, it's the seriousness of the charge. It's not whether they're actually guilty or not. It's not whether they've actually done it or not. It's just because someone made an accusation, and they should step down from their, whether a representative or a senator or a governor or the president. The seriousness of the charge, Chris, was so detrimental that they should step down. Now, if a Democrat got accused, listen, we got to wait till all the facts come out, and then there's got to be forgiveness, because people make mistakes. But I always remember that Rush Limbaugh would say it's the seriousness of the charge, and obviously he was saying it sarcastically, because that's what like we can't have this person in here. He was accused of this, whether it was true or not. Well, that's what's going on, and that's what's going on with Jesus right here. Here is Jesus, and they've accused him of all sorts of things. And Jesus doesn't say a word. He doesn't say a word. And so finally, the high priest has had enough. He's had enough of these false witnesses, and they've done a terrible job. They've done a terrible job, and he's like, okay, we're done. And Jesus, do you have anything to say for yourself? He doesn't say a word. He doesn't say a word. Why? Because Jesus knew this trial. The verdict was already in. The verdict was already in. It was not, hey, we need more witnesses. If we can just get one person to testify on Jesus' behalf, then maybe we'll change our mind. There was never going to be a changing of the mind. And Jesus knew that. And Jesus accepted that. And he willingly came to this point and suffered all of this, the mockery the spitting in the face and them smiting him. He's suffering all that. Why? Because he came to die for mine and your sins. And he had to die. He had to die. And so, but what I want us to look at next is they ask him. They said, hey, are you the Christ? Are you the Christ? And again, we've looked at this before. So for those of you who hadn't been here in a while, we've looked at this in the past. And they come to him and they say, hey, tell us, how long do you make us to doubt? And he said, I've told you. I have told you. And he tells him in that passage, he said, look, if you don't want to believe me, believe my works. If you don't want to believe me, just believe my works. Believe the works that I've done. Look at the works. And again, like I said, we've studied it, and people said, when Christ comes, will he do more miracles than this man doeth? Again, so there was this thing going on where some of the Jews were believing, some of the Jews were kind of on the fence, and some of the Jews were never going to believe. And so they had these conversations. If you remember where Nicodemus kind of stood up and tried to defend Jesus a little bit one time, and they got on to Nicodemus and said, are you from, there's no prophet that comes from Galilee. Are you from Galilee also? And so these people that were judging Jesus were those people that were constantly trying to discredit Jesus when he was performing his ministry. But now here they are, and now here he is before them, and so they ask him who he is, and he tells them who he is. And so in verse number 65, then the high priest rent his clothes, saying, he has spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? Behold, now you've heard his blasphemy. What think ye? They answered him, he is guilty of death. And I got to thinking, I just got to thinking about that right there. And I got to thinking about, what if this had been a real trial, Gil? What if this had been, again, you think about it, they've got Jesus here, and it's the middle of the night, and it's only a hostile crowd. John and Peter show up, and I don't know what happens to John, but he's gone. But we know that Peter denies the Lord right here, even though he wasn't actually in exactly where he was being tried, but he was at least close enough that Jesus could look at him and see him whenever he denied. But other than that, everyone else there appears to be hostile. But I got to thinking about what if this had been a real trial? And what if Jesus had said, excuse me, gentlemen, but I'd like to call a few witnesses for myself. I'd like to call a few witnesses for myself. And so I just went through the Gospels and just started writing down things. And in Matthew chapter 8, and we're not going to look at all these. We probably will look at a few, but in Matthew chapter number 8, verse 2 through 4, there was a leper that was cleansed. And Chris, when a leper was cleansed, guess who he had to go see? He had to go see the priest to be declared clean. And Jesus, over and over in his ministry, and like I said, we're going to look at some of them here, but Jesus, over and over in his ministry, when he would perform a miracle, and some of these people, I believe that many of these people that were sitting here right now were first-hand witnesses of Jesus' miracles and still rejected him. I believe they were first-hand witnesses. I believe they were first-hand, not second-hand, not third-hand, not I heard it from a friend who heard it from a friend who heard it from his cousins, brothers, uncles, nephew. No, I believe these are people that physically watched and saw. They saw this man that was a leper, and this man was no longer a leper, and he come to them and to be declared clean. And there wasn't no keeping it quiet, Brother Parks. What in the world happened to you? I thought the last time I saw you, I thought I'd never see you again. I figured you'd die a leper. I figured I'd never have to see you again. And yet here you are before me. And you're so excited. How in the world did you become clean? Well, there was this man named Jesus. And they're going to hear that over and over and over and over. And no doubt all these men that sat there, most of them were first-hand witnesses of Jesus and his miracles. And yet they were rejecting him and denying who he was, even though they knew who he was. In Matthew chapter number 8, verse 5 through 10, that the centurion's servant is healed. In Mark chapter number 2, we will flip over to Mark chapter number 2. In verse number 2, it says, straightway many were gathered together, insomuch that there was no room to receive them, no, not so much as about the door, and he preached the word unto them. And they come unto him, bringing one sick of the palsy, which was borne of 4. And when they could not come nigh unto him for the press, they uncovered the roof where he was. And when they had broken it up, they let down the bed wherein the sick of the palsy lay. When Jesus saw their faith, he said unto the sick of the palsy, Son, thy sins be forgiven thee. But there were certain of the scribes sitting there. The scribes were people who were at this trial. But there were certain of the scribes sitting there and reasoning in their hearts, why doth this man thus speak blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God only? And immediately when Jesus perceived in his spirit that they so reasoned within themselves, he said unto them, why reason ye these things in your hearts? They didn't say it out loud, Chris. They said it in their heart. They didn't even say it out loud. Whether is it easier to say to the sick of the palsy, thy sins be forgiven thee, or to say, arise and take up thy bed and walk? But that ye may know that the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins, he saith to the sick of the palsy, I say unto thee, arise, take up thy bed, and go thy way into thine house. And immediately arose and took up the bed, and went forth before them all, insomuch that they were all amazed, even the scribes, all amazed, and glorified God, saying, we never saw it on this fashion. So again, had this been a real trial, and had Jesus wanted to get off from the charges, he could have called 4 men that carried that bed and say, I'd just like to, just tell me your story. Tell me about your friend that was sick of the palsy. Tell me about him. Well, he couldn't get up. He couldn't walk. He was lame on part of his body, and so he couldn't walk. And so we wanted to get him to you, but you were in the house, and there were so many people in the house, it was impossible for us to get in the house. What did you do next? Well, we pulled the roof off of the house. We pulled the roof off, and we lowered him down through the roof to get him to you. And tell us what happened next. Again, like I said, think about this. Had this been a real trial, and then Jesus could have looked and said, wait a second, Mr. Scribe, I remember you. You were sitting there that day. You were sitting there that day. And can I get you to testify under oath that what these men right here are saying is true or untrue? Had Jesus, the high priest says, what need we any further of any more witnesses? Had Jesus been so inclined to and called his own witnesses, this would have been called a sham trial. This would have been thrown out of any court anywhere. Any court anywhere, as men started testifying of what Jesus had done for them and what Jesus had done, and Jesus had did what he said he was going to do. And so again, like I said, had those four men been called on to testify, had that man that was sick of the palsy said, I couldn't do anything for myself, and they carried me in that day, and Jesus said, thy sins be forgiven thee, and also take up thy bed and walk, and I got up and walked. Would anyone like to dispute that account? No disputing it. Even the scribes that sat there and watched it. Imagine having this on your conscience, Gil. Again, like I said, we all have been to court, or heard someone has been to court, or we've had to sit on a jury, and it's a very serious thing. Brother Samuel used to say all the time, serious business, friend. But it's a very serious thing. It's a serious thing. You sit there and you're judging these people, and it's just a matter of whether they're going to jail or not. It's just a matter, I've never been on a death penalty case, but it's just a matter of, they're going to go to jail for 6 months, a year, 3 years, or whatever. It's a matter of, are they going to have to pay restitution? Are they going to have to pay for damages or something like that? But it's a serious thing, and they work very hard. They work very hard at the beginning of the trial before they ever start presenting the case to figure out, do you know this person? Do you have any issues with this person? Are you willing to sit here as an impartial juror? A very serious thing. But here these men are sitting there, and they could not be partial. And there are scribes sitting there that sat there and watched Jesus heal this man that was sick of the palsy, and watched him heal him. And they could not testify against Jesus, but yet they were still going to be willing to say, yes, every one of them said he's guilty of death, he blasphemed. Even knowing in their heart of hearts. Again, it's also a very serious thing. If you work for the prosecution, and you're actually trying to prosecute, and you know that you're trying to convict an innocent man, it's a very serious thing for them to find out later that you knew that this man was innocent, and yet you prosecuted him anyway as a guilty man. If you held back information that could have got that man off. I listened to Trey Gowdy, his podcast once in a while, and he obviously was a lawyer. He was a prosecutor, and then he was the representative for South Carolina. But Brother Croft's shaking his head back there because I know he likes that kind of stuff. But I listened to him, and they have a question. They have a question podcast where people just send in and ask him questions, and he's very, very, very good at explaining how the judicial system works and how all that stuff works, and it actually helped me to understand that when you're a prosecutor, like, you would think like your job would be to prosecute people, but your job is to prosecute guilty people. not an innocent man just so you can clear, everyone's all up in arms because of this crime's happening, so if I just prosecute somebody, it'll get it out. No, it's very serious. And so here are these people, they're prosecuting Jesus for something that they know in their heart of hearts is not true. They know it's not true. And so when that high priest jumps up and says, do we need any more witnesses? He didn't want any witnesses on Jesus' side. All he wanted was Jesus saying that he was the Son of God. And guess what? He'd already told him that. In Mark chapter number 9, there was a woman with an issue of blood. I mean, think about it. Jesus said, hey, I'd like to call this woman. If he did choose to have witnesses, I'd like to call this woman with an issue of blood. Well, actually, let me rephrase that, Your Honor. She doesn't have an issue of blood anymore. This woman who had an issue of blood. And would you please come up and just tell me your story? Just tell me your story. Well, I heard about Jesus, and I had this issue of blood, and I had it for 12 years, and I tried everything. I tried doctors. I tried every kind of remedy known to man. And nothing ever helped. Well, what happened? Well, I just touched the hem of his garment. You mean to tell me all you did was touch the hem of his garment? Yes. And immediately, my issue of blood was healed. And Jesus said, hey, somebody touched me. And they made fun of Jesus for saying somebody touched me, like in this big crowd. Of course, how can people not touch you? And he said, no, virtue went out of me. No, somebody touched me. And it was that woman, and she had to tell Jesus what happened. I mean, Chris, imagine sitting on a jury and being impartial, and all you've heard was these false witnesses. And they couldn't get their story straight. And now had Jesus actually been allowed to call his own witnesses? And one after another. In Matthew chapter number 8, you had 2 blind men that received their sight. In Matthew chapter number 14, there's 5,000. Can you imagine calling all these witnesses? I mean, you think some of these trials take a long time. Can you imagine, Gil? I mean, that's just 5,000 men. That's not counting women and children. Every one of them say, tell us about that day. Well, we were there, and we'd been there a long time, and we'd been listening to Jesus, and Jesus said it's time to feed them. And y'all know, I mean, y'all work at camp. I mean, a lot of y'all work at camp. Y'all know what an effort it is just to feed, 400 or 500 people, 1 or 2 meals a day. You can imagine what it take feeding 5,000 just men, not counting women and children, and then all they have is 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Again, like you said, over and over and over. In Matthew chapter number 16, again, like I said, John said at the end of his gospel that if everything that Jesus had done, and this is me paraphrasing, if everything that Jesus had done had been written down, the world could not contain. The world could not contain. It's so much. It's so much. He done so much. In Matthew chapter number 16, verse number, I guess I wrote the wrong chapter. But anyway, there was a great multitude of lame and blind that came to Jesus. Right here, sorry, Matthew 15. And great multitudes came unto him, having with them those that were lame, blind, dumb, maimed, and many others, and cast them down at Jesus' feet, and he healed them. Great multitude, insomuch that the multitude wondered when they saw the dumb to speak, and the maimed to be whole, and the lame to walk, and the blind to see, and they glorified the God of Israel. So it's a great multitude. Again, we have just like certain, again, we have the blind man in the book of John that was blind from birth. We just have like just a couple. But there are certain times where it just appears that Jesus came to town. And they just started bringing everyone. If you were sick, they brought him to Jesus. If you were blind, they brought him to Jesus. If you were lame, they brought him to Jesus. If you were dumb, they brought him to Jesus. Anything that was wrong, if they could just get him to Jesus, and Jesus healed him. Again, like I said, had he been so inclined and so allowed to call his own witnesses, he would have got off. But Chris, he didn't come to get off. He come to get on the cross and die on the cross for our sins. If you look in Mark chapter number 9, verse number 14. And when he came to his disciples, he saw a great multitude about them. And the scribes, here are the scribes again, questioning with them. And straightway all the people, when they beheld him, were greatly amazed, and running to him saluted him. And he asked the scribes, Jesus asked the scribes, what question ye with them? And one of the multitude answered and said, Master, I have brought unto thee my son, which hath a dumb spirit. And wheresoever he taketh him, he teareth him, and foameth and gnasheth with his teeth, and pineth away. And I spake to thy disciples, and they should cast him out, and they could not. He answered him and saith, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring him unto me. And they brought him unto him, and when he had saw him, straightway the spirit tear him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed foaming. And he asked his father, How long is it ago since this came unto him? And he said, Of a child. And oftentimes it hath cast him into the fire and into the waters to destroy him. But if thou canst do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Jesus said unto him, If thou canst believe, all things are possible to him that believeth. Straightway the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. When Jesus saw that people came running together, he rebuked the foul spirit, saying unto him, Thou dumb and deaf spirit, I charge thee, come out of him, and enter no more into him. And the spirit cried, and rent him sore, and came out of him, and he was as one dead, insomuch that many said, He is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And so again, here had Jesus had the opportunity to call on witnesses. He could have called this man. He could have called this man's son who was healed. He could have called the scribes who watched it happen. Again, scribes who were sitting there judging him and going to pronounce him guilty of death, worthy of death. And he could have said, let me ask y'all a story. Let me ask you a story about a time when a man brought his son. A man brought his son, and he brought him to the disciples, and the disciples tried to cast out that devil and could not. And y'all were arguing amongst yourselves. And when I showed up, what happened? Just tell us, Mr. Scribe. Mr. Scribe, tell us exactly what you saw that day. And tell us the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Chris, they knew the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And yet they rejected him over and over and over and over again. In Mark chapter number 5, and I'll stop right here because I actually have a whole nother page of notes that we'll get to next week. But in Mark chapter number 5, verse number 1, we'll read this right here. And they came over unto the other side of the sea into the country of the Gadarenes. And when they were come out of the ship, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, who had his dwelling among the tombs, and no man could bind him, no, not with chains, because that he had been often bound with fetters and chains, and the chains had been plucked asunder by him, and the fetters broken in pieces, neither could any man tame him. And always night and day he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus afar off, he ran and worshipped him, and cried with a loud voice and said, What have I to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of the Most High God? I adjure thee by God that thou torment me not. For he said unto him, Come out of the man, thou unclean spirit. Now we know it's not the man here. It's this unclean spirit that is worshiping him and says, I know who you are. I know who you are. You're Jesus, the Son of the Most High God. And he asked him, What is thy name? And he answered, saying, My name is Legion, for we are many. And he besought him much that he would not send them away out of the country. Now there was there nigh unto the mountains a great herd of swine feeding, and all the devils besought him, saying, Send us into the swine, that we may enter into them. And forthwith Jesus gave them leave, and the unclean spirits went out and entered into the swine, and the herd ran violently down a steep place into the sea, and there were about 2,000, and were choked in the sea. And they that fed the swine fled and told it in the city and in the country. And they went out to see what it was that was done. And they come to Jesus and say, See him that was possessed with the devil, and had the legion sitting, and clothed, and in his right mind. And they were afraid. And so again, had Jesus been able to call a witness, he could have called this no longer maniac of Gadara, who's now clothed and sitting and in his right mind, and say, tell me about your life. And they would have saw scars. Those scars don't go away, Brother Parks. They would have saw scars where he cut himself all over his body. And they could have called people from around there and said, Tell us about this young man. Oh, we tried everything. We couldn't build a chain big enough or strong enough that he couldn't break loose from it. We couldn't hold him, we couldn't bind him, we couldn't do anything. Well, tell us what happened after Jesus was there. I tell you what, he was just the nicest, he was the kindest, most gentle young man you ever met in all your life. I mean, he was such a nice, well, never would have dreamed it was the same person. Had we not seen those scars, had we not seen those cuttings, had he not looked exactly like him, never would have dreamed. Now, I understand what happened. They run Jesus out because they lost their swine. I understand that they run Jesus out of the country. They're like, Hey, we need you to just go. I understand that. But had they been called on to testify and testified honestly, Brother Parks, they would have said, Hey, never would have believed anyone could do anything with that young man. Never would have dreamed that young man would have been anything but a terror his whole entire life, until finally he just cut himself and finally cut one of his main arteries and died where he bled out. But then Jesus came by one day, and that young man was never the same. Again, like I said, had Jesus been able to call on witnesses, it would have been undeniable. He was who he said he was. We'll get into it more next week. Thank you all for listening.